Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car. He was very sexual and very driven, and I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
But soon, the thrill ride gets out of control.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women.
All these revelations are coming out from people who he has ripped off.
This is where things took a dangerous turn, and he made a threat against her life.
I went out and bought myself a rifle. I was terrified of what might happen. I grew up in Australia, in a fairly rural area, on a cow farm. My intention was to take over the family business, but my father is somewhat old school in that he likes to keep the men in the business and the women at home.
Her dad does agree to support her financially.
One of the things that interested me was esthetician. So I did a course in that, and then I opened my own business in a gym in Melbourne. I met my first husband at the gym.
The couple marry in 1996 when Brooklyn is 27, and she gives birth to her first son a year later.
By the time I was pregnant with my second son, I was working and I had a toddler, and my patience with my husband was really just running low. I said to him, "You're gonna have to go because you're not pulling your weight."
A year later, she's ready to dip her toes back into the dating pool.
She met Paul Carter on RSVP, the online dating site. He was single, unmarried, without children, and looking for love.
Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car, and that epitomized Paul's personality. He was flashy, he was showy. We got romantically involved pretty quickly from that point. He was very sexual and a great lover, and I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
Eventually, Brooklyn introduces her sons to Paul.
And he got along great with them, and he was happy to play with them and spend time with them, and so they thought he was great.
For 6 months, the four are spending all of their weekend time together. Eventually, work intervenes, and Paul says he has to focus on some business matters.
I started to get suspicious. I couldn't understand why I was never invited to his place. So one day when he was in the shower, I pulled his driver's license from his wallet and got his address. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go pay a visit and see what's going on at this house. I pull up to the house and I knocked on the door, and this older man, Paul's dad, answered the door. And I said, "Is Paul Carter here?" And he said, "Do you mean Paul Cristallo?" And I said, "No, Paul Carter. This is his address." He said, "Well, Paul Cristallo lives here with his wife, Sonia, and he has 3 kids from his previous marriage."
Brooklyn decides to confront Paul, who simply shrugs it off.
He says, "Yes, I'm married, but we're separated and we're just living in the house together." It didn't sound unrealistic.
In March 2003, 8 months after first meeting Paul, he surprises Brooklyn with a grand gesture.
Paul proposed to me at the beach. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. So we got married on St Kilda Beach in Melbourne. I finally felt like I had the family that I had not had for my whole life. We decided to have a child together, and we had Mac. who is the love of my life, and he is my heart and soul.
In 2010, Paul was appointed the CEO of United Housing Victoria, which is a publicly funded community housing company, and there he ran big sort of multi-million-dollar construction jobs. He was let go after 2 years because they saw they were just hemorrhaging money. The suspicion was that Paul was blowing out the contracts of these construction jobs and pocketing that money.
I was panic-stricken, and Paul's way of placating me was to say, I'll just pick up extra jobs on the side. We were in a bad place in our marriage. We ended up having to sell the house. My dad was furious. He was putting pressure on my ex-husband. My father said to him, I will pay for your lawyers and I will put the kids through school. They took me to court and they filed for custody of my sons.
Finally, in 2013, Brooklyn loses custody of her 2 oldest sons, who are now 12 and 15.
For a long time, I was so focused on the court battle with my kids that I was not paying attention to my husband. There was constant stress in the house. Bills needed to be paid. I really didn't have a lot of options other than to take back control myself. So we got an E2 treaty visa, which is granted to Australians who invest into a business in the United States. We had been to Boston to visit, and I loved it there. So I bought a couple of houses and rented them out.
Coincidentally, Paul comes into a windfall.
Paul announced to me that he had inherited a large plot of land from his grandmother, and the government were trying to buy that land because they wanted to put a highway through. He showed me some documentation, which was incredibly exciting because he was telling me that it was worth tens of millions of dollars.
Brooklyn feels hope for the first time since losing custody of her oldest sons. But she's worried how their absence is affecting Mac, her youngest. Brooklyn suggests to Paul that they move to Boston.
By this stage, he was working for himself as a builder, and he had various projects underway. He said, okay, great, we'll buy houses, renovate them and flip them and start a new life. So Mac and I are in Boston. He was happy, I was happy, and we were expecting that Paul would join us within 2, maybe 3 months. It was the middle of the night, and I was woken up by Mac, who was then 8 years old, who had his iPad in his hand. So he hands me his iPad and says, "Who is this lady in the picture with Dad?" I'm realizing that this is not an old photo from some time before my time with Paul. This is something that's going on now that shouldn't be going on.
It doesn't take long to figure out that the event is an engagement party, and the lady in red is Paul's new fiancée.
Catherine Dubois was a Melbourne woman. She was a bit of a socialite, had great friends, but love was missing, and so she went online to find that. Catherine met Paul on Tinder. He claimed to be a self-made millionaire, this big property empire across Melbourne and Queensland. It was about 12 weeks into their love story. Paul got down on one knee and asked Catherine to marry him, and it was an easy yes for her. After Catherine and Paul's engagement party, she receives a call from somebody who knows Paul, and they tell her, he has a wife and child in the US. You need to end this.
Paul and Catherine break off their relationship, and in November 2014, Paul heads off to Boston and attempts to patch up his relationship with Brooklyn.
He was able to convince me that he was remorseful for what he had done. I'd already been through a divorce and lost my kids. I wasn't going to risk doing that again and losing my youngest son. So I was going to do whatever I had to do to make it work.
Paul has one more gambit to keep Brooklyn happy.
Early 2018, we took over a lease on a horse farm that we were to purchase. We had scheduled the closing to coincide with plenty of time for the money to come from overseas.
With the final payment on the farm looming, Brooklin puts pressure on Paul for some financial relief.
Paul came home and said, there's no inheritance. There isn't any money coming, there's no money. I slid down the fridge and onto the floor like a cartoon character. The whole game was up.
Furious and deeply betrayed, Brooklin kicks Paul out. Paul, cut off from his slush fund, is angry and desperate.
He was really angry. And he says to me, I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to make sure I take you down with me. And I just felt chills go down my spine.
Brooklin gets a restraining order, and then finally, after 16 years of marriage, she files for divorce. In August 2019, the divorce becomes final, and Brooklin gets full custody of Mac. But there is just one problem.
I became increasingly concerned about being on the same visa as Paul Carter. My very close friend suggested that we get married because we both had no intentions of ever remarrying in our lives.
Brooklin and her female friend hold a garden wedding in Albany in September 2019. Before the couple can even move in together, Brooklyn's life takes an unforeseen turn.
He may look like an ordinary bloke, but this is one of Australia's most cunning con men.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women he made believe that he loved them.
Paul Carter.
He hadn't had time to prepare any answers, but he still denied everything.
So I keep hearing this, but I don't know who you're talking about.
He's just denied, 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 denied.
What about the Italian inheritance that didn't exist?
There isn't one.
Was that another mistake?
Yeah, it was.
After the expose, Paul Carter becomes the subject of a Homeland Security investigation.
We execute a search warrant at his residence. We immediately arrested Paul Carter. So we took him into custody on the felony charges of visa fraud and false statements.
A couple of months later, it was about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's a knock on the door. Brooklyn, we need you to open the door. It's Homeland Security.
Brooklyn is suspected of committing marriage fraud with her wife in order to gain a green card.
I was not prepared to drag her or her family through the mud with the government.
Brooklyn divorces her wife in June 2020.
Brooklyn Carter ultimately pled guilty to making false statements on the ESTA application, which is utilized to re-enter the United States at some point.
Paul Carter also faces his day of reckoning in a federal court.
Paul Carter was sentenced to time served and a $5,000 fine. We were not, as an agency, pleased with the sentence, but he's now a convicted felon, which in part is based on the work that our agency and our office did.
Meanwhile, because of Brooklyn's conviction, she must leave the United States. A huge disappointment, but there is a silver lining. A man named Sean Donahue.
I can't overstate how wonderful he has been to Mac and I. He's the happy ending that we deserve. I've been dragged through the gates of hell to get to the happy ending. I've come out the other end. It's going to make a good story for my grandchildren, that's for sure.